In one of the biggest mass executions in decades, Saudi Arabia executed 81 men on Saturday, which included 7 Yemenis and 1 Syrian.
If you speak with anyone who's ever been in jail, they'd tell you that there's a lot of needed improvement when it comes to our prison system. From the unfair treatment of inmates to some of the conditions where they're left, and much more, many people have called for complete reforms in the prison system. Still, you'd be surprised to find that many countries around the world have rather extreme methods of dealing with criminals. In this video, we'll look at some countries where criminals are punished rather weirdly, as well as the things that these criminals have to go through regularly, all in the name of being rehabilitated. The Philippines. When it comes to countries where prisoners are treated like absolute garbage, there aren't actually so many options that can top the Philippines. The country, located in Southeast Asia, is one of the region's biggest tourist destinations. Still, this doesn't mean that everything's rosy with the Philippines, especially if you get caught in a crime. You see, the major issue with the Philippines and criminals stems from the country's former leader, Rodrigo Duterte. From all indications, this man was as ruthless as he was brash. And when it came to criminals, he especially had no modicum of mercy. When Duterte came into power in 2016, one of his promises was that he'd tackle the Philippines' crime problem head-on. And boy, he was not joking around.
Reporters say Duterte transformed the city from one of the Philippines' most dangerous to one of the safest.
Within his first 100 days in office, Duterte advocated for the re-imposition of capital punishment for what he termed heinous crimes, such as illicit substance trade and much more. To date, no one really knows how many people were killed as a result of Duterte's unyielding war on drugs. The Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency pegs that number at about 6,200, while the International Criminal Court goes as high as 30,000. I mean, that's a fairly huge number if you ask anyone. For a man to have a case against the International Criminal Court, you know he definitely messed up. Away from Duterte, one structure that really shows just how crazy life is for Filipino criminals is the Manila City Jail. Located in the capital city of Manila, this jail has been around since the 19th century. However, it solidified its status as one of the most overcrowded prisons in the world following Duterte's ascension as the country's president and his brutal crusade on substance trafficking. Anyone caught dealing or using hard substances is sent to prison without so much as a trial, and they can be stuck there for decades, with no inkling of when they'll get out.
The Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency admits the demand for illegal drugs remains, despite the previous administration's brutal war on drugs.
Today, the Manila City Jail is capable of housing just about 1,000 inmates. However, by December 2018, it had about 6,300 inmates and is estimated to currently be operating at an average of 463.6% occupancy. Life in this prison is so intense that inmates literally have to sleep in shifts. Many are forced to sleep side by side on any available floor space. Some even have to sleep on the stairs. In fact, some inmates have claimed that there are several of them who don't have room to sleep at night and have to sleep standing up. Life in this jail is hard enough as it is. And even though Duterte left power in 2022, it doesn't seem like the campaign against crime that he led is letting up anytime soon. So, good luck to anyone found committing a crime here. North Korea. If there is one country that always seems to find itself on the wrong side of things, it's North Korea. From reports of the government sponsoring hacking groups to its weird isolation from the rest of the world, North Korea truly is one of the most bizarre places on the planet. From all indications, life in North Korea can be pretty rough. I mean, if you're not connected to the government or an affluent member of society, chances are you're living in extremely despondent conditions. So, if the regular, everyday people can be living like this, you've kind of got to ask yourself, what would life be like for criminals? Well, in a nutshell, things can be pretty rough. For one, punishment in the country tends to be based on more arbitrary structures, so things can definitely vary. To get an example of this, there have been reports of North Korean citizens being subjected to weird, old-timey punishments, such as public shaming. This one is especially difficult, as you can imagine. People who are seen as dissidents and criminals are immediately ostracized from their communities.
A country whose people suffer from international sanctions because their ruler instills terror in the world.
And in a country where the government puts a heavy premium on being perceived as loyal, anyone caught in this situation will pretty much be isolated from others. If you do get sent to prison in North Korea, however, you can imagine that things won't be rosy as well. Not much is known about the country's prisons, but some people who have lived there have claimed that the conditions are absolutely terrible. Besides the cockroach-infested, thin beds to dirt-filled bread and pale rice as food, prisoners are even forced to drink dirty water because there is no potable water anywhere in the prisons. As for the criminals who aren't lucky enough to be sent to prison, it is worth noting that capital punishment remains a legal penalty for crimes in North Korea. So, the government could literally decide to have a person's head. Yeah, no wonder this isn't a hot spot for tourist activity. Am I right? The United States. For a country that promotes law and order, the United States surely has a pretty high number of inmates. Every state in the country has a prison, and we even have supermax correctional facilities such as Alcatraz and Guantanamo Bay that are being operated by the U.S. government. Now, we can debate about the faults in America's prison system all we want, but while there are a lot of incarcerations, several authorities in the country have also imposed rather creative ways of dealing with criminals. For instance, in Ohio, a municipal court judge named Michael Cicconetti has become rather popular for administering what he terms creative justice. Basically, when a criminal gets in front of this judge, he gives them a choice, either to spend time in jail or take part in one of his unique punishment styles.
Well, the one you're about to meet is not your average gavel-banging magistrate. His Honor's got a unique way of dispensing justice to the people who show up in his courtroom.
Over the years, Judge Cincinetti's punishments have been quite, well, creative. For instance, he once asked a woman to spend a night in the woods for abandoning 35 kittens in a forest. In another instance, the judge asked teenagers who flattened the tires on school buses to throw a picnic for the primary school students whose outing was canceled due to the prank. And in a separate instance, the judge ordered a woman who stole from a church to spell out the sentence, "I stole coins from the church," entirely in coins, and apologized to each worshiper as they went in. You might think that this judge was going over the line, but when you consider that his court had a repeat offense rate of just 10%, while the national average was 75%, who knows? Maybe he was onto something. El Salvador. By all accounts, El Salvador is a small country, but, like many other Central American nations, it has had a bit of a rough history with crime. All of that swiftly changed when its current president, Nayib Bukele, came into power in June 2019. Currently 43 years old, Bukele has become more popular for making the audacious move to turn El Salvador into a hub for cryptocurrencies. He even used some of the country's national reserves to purchase Bitcoin back in 2020, a move that has seen some pretty mixed reviews. But while he might want you to think of him as a hip, cool Bitcoin bro, Bukele has a bit of a dark side as well, one that has seen him build a bit of a rough reputation. You see, just like Duterte did in the Philippines, Bukele has also ruled El Salvador with an iron fist. And when it comes to crimes, this guy does not mess around. Now, to the casual observer, Bukile's war on crime and street gangs is necessary. The man saw a problem, and he's taking a radical approach towards solving it. But, for experts, this is a humanitarian crisis waiting to happen.
Look at El Salvador. Their president rounded up all the gang members, threw them in a high-security lockdown.
According to reports, Bukile's regime has rounded well over $75,000 suspected gangsters and thrown them in jail, some of whom were imprisoned for the crime of just wearing tattoos. Besides this, about 7,000 people have reportedly been imprisoned without a single shred of evidence. And many of these innocents, particularly the minors, remain behind bars today. As you would imagine, life as a criminal in El Salvador isn't rosy as well. With such a large number of inmates, El Salvador's prisons have been pretty crowded. And although the country has so-called mega prisons, even those remain quite stuffed. To make things worse, there have even been reports that many prisoners' families have to pay exorbitant fees just so they can get some of the basic necessities while behind bars. That's just how insane the conditions here can get. Nevertheless, many Salvadorians love Bukile's hardline stance on crime. So much so that he had an approval rate of 92% earlier this year. The man inherited a bleeding country that was seen by many sources and experts as the world's murder capital. And under his rule, crime rates have gone down drastically. So, it's kind of a double-edged sword. El Salvador is safer under Bukile, but that safety has so far come at a huge human cost. Norway. From all indications, Norway is a pretty chill country. It's one of the wealthiest nations in the world, and thanks to a combination of factors such as its healthcare, weather, and others, its citizens are generally seen as among the happiest on the planet as well. One major reason why Norwegians are so happy is because of the country's low crime rate. But, even at that, there are some peculiarities that just make life as a prisoner in Norway quite interesting. To really understand life as a Norwegian prisoner, it's first important to get this point out of the way. In this country, the entire point of punishment for prisoners is just to restrict their liberty. Essentially, a criminal in a Norwegian prison has the very same rights as every other free person. And that even includes the right to vote in elections. As of 2018, Norway had about 43 prisons, and according to reports, the country practices the import model, where inmates get services such as healthcare, education, and even access to a library. Inmates are allowed to work, allowed to enroll in special schools, and are free to engage in several recreational activities throughout their stay in prison.
This is home?
Yeah, this is home, yeah.
Karsten was convicted of killing a man in Brazil. This is his cell block with a full kitchen, big screen TV, laundry room.
Norway even has a tiered system for its prisons. There are open prisons, closed prisons, and transitional housing. The closed prisons are exactly as they sound. Facilities with fences and walls where inmates are locked and monitored by correctional officers. However, in open prisons, inmates are only locked in at night. They can't leave the prisons, but they're generally freer. They can make calls, visit prison campuses whenever they want, and they're even free to make contact with members of the community through means of visitations, furloughs, and more. As for transitional housing, this is mostly used when a prisoner has completed part of their sentence. They remain in the prison system, but are under less strict control. Essentially, the goal is to help return the inmates gradually to society, offering them things like professional and social training, and even setting them up with a network once they get back into society. Pretty much everything about Norway's prisons sounds humane. And in a world where just about every country tends to take a pretty hardline stance against criminals and offenders, it sure is interesting to see how the Norwegians maintain an aura of humanity around them. Iran, another country that unsurprisingly gets in the news for the wrong reasons, is Iran. And to be honest, it's kind of easy to see why. Iran is a nuclear power with some extreme views, and over the years, it has clashed with many Western powers on numerous occasions. As a country that's ruled basically by a religious institution, you can imagine that many of the ways Iran chooses to engage in punishment can be a bit extreme. For instance, instead of just throwing people in prisons, Iranian authorities have been known to engage in activities such as public flogging and humiliation. Public floggings are especially commonplace in Iran. These are mostly used to deter minor cases such as theft. But there have also been instances where they went to the extreme, such as women being beaten in public just because they took off their head coverings and scarves. Now, you've got to remember, many of Iran's rulers and lawmakers are rather hardcore Muslims. As such, crimes such as women exposing their hair or even sensitive parts of their bodies will not be taken lightly. Besides the rather peculiar way of punishing petty crimes, Iran's authorities also engage in an activity known as white torture. Basically, this happens when a person is locked in a white room and deprived of any sensory stimulation. They can't hear anything, smell anything, or see anything apart from the pale white structure. And over time, their senses start to deteriorate to the point where it's pretty difficult even to tell what's real and what's fake. White torture can also include the use of illumination to deprive the victim of sleep. Now, in Iran's case, this is mostly done at facilities outside the control of official prison authorities. Still, even though the Iranian government and prison authorities have claimed that they don't know anything about this, it's pretty difficult to prove that when the atrocities are being conducted in their name. Finally, we have additional methods the Iranian government uses to get justice.
The White House said today that the U.S. and Israel believe Iran and its proxies across the region could launch a significant attack in the coming days.
These include the famous eye for an eye method, where punishments are meted out based on the perceived crime. For instance, a person found guilty of stealing could have his hand cut off. A man accused of could lose his genitals. And some people who commit more heinous offenses could even be stoned and beaten in public spaces. All of these are punishments that you would think would have been outlawed at this point. But, for some reason, they still find a lot of use and application in a country like Iran. Considering that the government holds a lot of sway in these parts, the citizens are kept in constant fear of what might happen if they decide to act out or revolt against their rulers. And with the Iranian government holding on to its autonomy even in the face of sanctions and isolation from the rest of the world, you can only imagine how long these punishments will run for. Sudan. Still on the subject of countries that tend to always be in the news for the wrong reasons, our next spotlight is being shown on none other than Sudan. If you've been watching the news, then you'd know that Sudan is currently in the midst of a bloody war between two warring factions looking to rule the country. For a nation that's been in the midst of one war or the other for decades, this one is pretty gnarly. And while there are different viewpoints, it's pretty clear that the people suffering the most from this are the country's everyday citizens. At such a time as this, when Sudan is at war, there are bound to be increases in crime rates. But this is something the country can ill afford, especially as its prisons are already in pretty terrible shape. According to reports, Sudan was already battling an overcrowding problem as far back as 2011. At the time, the country had about 14,000 inmates, even though its prisons could only hold about 4,000 people. Because of this overcrowding issue, many in Sudan's prisons have now had to deal with truly subhuman conditions, from a lack of health care access to insufficient sanitary facilities. In fact, it's even been said that Sudan's prisons don't have the capacity to feed their inmates.
Now, if Southern Sudan becomes Africa's newest nation, building the new country will not be easy. Among the many areas in need is the penal reform.
This means that prisoners have to rely on food brought by their family members. And even then, this food could end up being stolen by the guards, with inmates left to rot and starve behind bars. Prisoners have been said to suffer terrible abuse, with beatings and deprivation of basic human necessities being the order of the day here. As you would imagine, this has led to several deaths, with a combination of terrible health care and generally poor prison conditions being too much for some prisoners to bear. Away from the prisons, Sudan has also suffered from a routine inability to seemingly separate offenders. For instance, while most developed countries have juvenile detention centers where underage offenders are placed, there's no such thing in Sudan. As long as they have been flagged for committing a crime, anyone is eligible to be thrown in jail. And to make matters worse, it doesn't even have to be the most severe crime. Even for something as seemingly mundane as stealing, a teenager could end up behind bars for decades. There have been several attempts to rectify this. In 2004, Sudan tried to adopt a so-called child law, which aimed to help the country adhere to international standards, especially when it came to the incarceration of children. But, so far, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that this law has been implemented. And with the country now in the middle of a civil war and more people being termed criminals and enemies of the state, you can imagine that there will be even more atrocities going on in Sudan's prisons. Russia. If there's any country where the words hard knock life hold true, it's probably got to be Russia. From the country's depictions in movies to its position in global geopolitics, it's become pretty clear that Russia is one nation where only the strong survive. Well, this strength is definitely going to be needed when a person gets into prison in Russia as well. With over 800 prisons and almost 500,000 inmates, Russia has always proven to be hard on criminals. In fact, the country is so intense that it has a prison in the middle of a frozen wasteland island. Yeah, these guys don't mess around. Although the environments in Russia's prisons can be different, the country is known to have some uniform behaviors. For instance, prisoners serving life sentences in this country are especially treated harshly, with most of them being held separately from other inmates. Besides that, life sentence prisoners are mandated to be handcuffed when being moved outside of their cells. They're prohibited from laying on their beds at hours that aren't designated sleeping times, and even on their rest times, they are confined to tiny rooms where they are monitored around the clock. Considering that most of these conditions are inherited from the conditions in which death row inmates awaited execution in the last years of the Soviet Union, it's pretty safe to say that you don't want to be a life sentence prisoner in Mother Russia. Afghanistan. Under normal circumstances, Afghanistan should be one of the most prosperous nations in the world. It has massive oil and gas deposits and a budding population. But several factors, including religious extremism and the impacts of war, have left the country in a much worse position than you would think. Ever since the Taliban became a thing, Afghanistan has never exactly known peace. It was severely affected when the war in Iraq commenced, and with the entire Middle East being destabilized from then on, Afghanistan's fortunes have pretty much eroded. To add insult to injury, American troops left Afghanistan a few years ago, making way for the Taliban to take over. Now, the terrorist group has managed to establish a pretty strong foothold in the country, and they're sure not letting up. So now, you have a country that is filled with a lot of radical Muslim people, and which is being run by an officially recognized terrorist group. Yeah, things couldn't get any worse. Ever since the Taliban took over, they've imposed their special brand of Sharia law on Afghanistan. And boy, have they been doing some pretty hardcore stuff. According to the United Nations, there have been hundreds of cases of extrajudicial killing, arbitrary arrests, and detentions in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over. Brutal deaths are the order of the day, and several people have even been reported missing. Basically, if the Taliban sees someone as a threat, they could be killed or kidnapped without anyone else being able to say a thing. The rights of women are especially curtailed in this country. Women are given little to no rights, and anyone who speaks up can be persecuted by the Taliban to the full extent of their capabilities. The Taliban is pretty much the law in Afghanistan, so if they determine that someone is a problem, it's pretty much curtains for such a person. Cameroon, one nation that doesn't get much attention, but which absolutely should, is Cameroon. The West African nation is home to a plethora of raw materials, so it should ideally be pretty wealthy. But, like many other developing countries, this just isn't so. In fact, according to most experts, things are so bad in Cameroon that the people no longer have faith in the government or the official justice system. Instead, they rely on their brand of mob justice. Over the years, Cameroon has seen a steadily increasing crime rate. Because unemployment in the country is so high, most of its young people have resorted to vices just to make ends meet. Theft, robberies, kidnappings, and even hired killings are now the order of the day. And to make things worse, many of these criminals work for organizations that seem to have ties with the government. All of this has meant that if a person gets arrested for these crimes, chances are they won't even get to face the music. They might not even get as much as a slap on the wrist before they're incorporated into society again. The people know this, and over time, they've decided they just can't trust the police. In a way, this is even worse, because if there's anything worse than a society where the police are corrupt, it's one where the people suddenly become empowered to do whatever they like.
When his term ends in 2025, he'll be in his 90s, and increasingly attention is turning to his successor.
Cameroonians have become frustrated and tend to take out these frustrations on criminals that they find. In this country, criminals are subjected to a wide array of punishments, from public, extensive flogging to literal beheading. And if a police officer even tries to get involved in the entire mix, they could find themselves at the end of a few strokes as well. With this arbitrary form of punishment, criminals are quite literally putting their lives at risk. Because a person could literally be found stealing and could be killed immediately, depending on how everyone else is feeling at the point when they get caught. Once again, the fact that issues like unemployment and government corruption will probably remain means that a lot of these jungle justice moments won't stop as well. And in a country where people get more and more frustrated, good luck trying to convince them to be more humane when they come across criminals. At the end of the day, it seems pretty clear that a life of crime is definitely not worth it. Because if you think that just being in a terrible jail is the worst thing that can happen to you, some of these countries will definitely make you reconsider. What do you think, though? Are some of these punishments in these countries fair, or have they gone too far? Let us know in the comments.